for about 5 minutes each. And obviously, towards the end of the session, I'll start shortening the time, but not for now. So I open up the floor. No contributions? Man, you were good.
It's no good sign.
Just a footnote. The name which I couldn't remember. Wonderful play, written in 1968-69 by David Edgar, Factory Occupations. If you can find a video of it or a script of it, it's very good. It's kind of Gramsci on stage, from a language perspective.
Okay, cool.
Yes?
I just wanted to sort of talk a bit more about some of the things that you raised, Luke, about the question of passive revolution, because that's certainly something which to many people seems to challenge some orthodox Marxist views about how social change happens, because of course we have a situation where people like Lenin and Trotsky after the First World War are pretty much saying democracy's on the way out, bourgeoisie's exhausted, the phrases socialism or barbarism really comes to the fore and so on. And you can understand that within the perspective in which they're talking, of course, with the rise of fascism and things like that. That certainly sounds very true. But now we have a situation after the Second World War where states which are technically liberal democratic, there's far more of them in the world today than there has been at any point in the last 200 years or so. Like, there's actually been a growth and spread of ostensibly democratic states. And so you have a situation where Trotsky saying only the working class revolutions and permanent revolution can achieve this fundamentally, and then you have the reality that we live in today where that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that actually the bourgeoisie has carried out these kind of changes for the better. And of course, Gramsci's grappling with that point that, he agrees with Marx in 1848, 1850 that the bourgeoisie is exhausted as a revolutionary class. Their ability to carry out things like the French Revolution or the American War of Independence is gone. That was a time for the young bourgeoisie. And what you have is a bourgeoisie which is increasingly conservative and backward-looking and actually counter-revolutionary, in the sense it wants to stop mass revolutionary upheavals and things like that. So I think the idea of passive revolution in that sense, that you can, if you see how states form and change and shift within the socio-economic terrain on an international scale, that the bourgeoisie, through various different mechanisms, whether it's international finance, capital and things like that, can be forced to carry out quite far-reaching socio-economic transformations of the country, i.e., kind of installing more democratic regimes. Of course, that's not happening today in Greece and Italy. It's going the other way, because under international finance capital, they're actually bringing kind of like technocratic, undemocratic regimes. But the point that Peter Thomas makes in his very good book, The Gramscian Moment, about how you have a situation where, and he quotes Matthew Arnold, who's a poet, that you have modernity is wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. And that refers to, the deadness of bourgeois society, so really being able to develop things and take society forward, but at the same time the sense that the working class is often doesn't have the right political leadership to take advantage of organic crises and those very real fractures which happen within the social, civil and political superstructure in order to actually achieve a socialist revolution. And so I'll just wind up on the question of hegemony, because I think that if you really look at sort of the way that Perry Anderson wrote about Gramsci in the 1970s, he wrote a very interesting article called The Antinomies of Antonio Gramsci, which is very critical, and basically said within Gramsci you can get a lot of reformist readings, which is what Luke was talking about. But Peter Thomas's book corrects some of that and says, yes, it is possible to have this reading of it, but that's not what Gramsci intended. He intended a different understanding. He was grappling with very real political problems that existed after the failure of the Russian Revolution to spread. The idea of hegemony, everyone talks about it in academia, but it always has a class content. and it always refers to either a class using hegemony to try and maintain control and domination and power and so on, or it refers to the task of, the subaltern classes or the working classes in being able to, create a united front, if you want, of different subaltern forces in order to be able to achieve a revolution. You can see that with the Occupy movement today, which is that there's clearly an organic crisis of capitalism. People are talking about anti-capitalism and criticising the system, and there is this movement, the Occupy movement, which in some ways is quite liberal in a sense, because it's demanding a separation of politics from economics, i.e. get the corporations out of our democratic state. Now, a real revolutionary working class movement, of course, doesn't demand separation of politics and economics. It demands the working class political control over the economic proper. But the working class is not really involved in these movements, and certainly it's sympathetic, it gets onto the protests and things, but it's not in a hegemonic position of leadership. And so I think using those terms, we can actually understand some of the problems that we have today, and it points to the central role of the working class in coming to the head of these kind of movements and actually trying to take advantage of that organic crisis to overthrow the system.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm not sure about this. Your suggestion that there is no Gramscian tradition, if I understood correctly. I think Gramsci's most important, as far as I'm concerned, contribution is about the resilience of capitalism. Just that capitalism is a resilient social system, and then in a way there is a Gramscian tradition, because it is because of Gramsci, that we moved from that kind of historical determinism, that the contradictions of capitalism will inevitably lead to revolution. The civil society, the hegemonic kind of struggle goes on throughout this civil society structure. I actually tend to disagree with that there is no Gramscian tradition. I think you're interpreting this a bit retrospectively, that the Trotsky influence on Gramscian thinking. This is my take on all. But I enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, briefly, I just wanted to, there was a comment made about how there are more bourgeois democratic regimes now than there was in the first half of the 20th century, and I think that's true on one level, but only on a superficial level, because the fact is that the democratic revolution is not so much about the right to vote. It's it's about at the time when Trotsky was developing the theory of permanent revolution, it was about land ownership. It was about the emancipation of the peasantry, and it's always the right to vote and what have you, and democratic freedoms and all that, kind of superstructural side of the economic drive of the democratic revolution. I think, in that sense, like the comment said about Greece and Italy and whatever. It shows you what's happening there. It shows you how superficial democratic rights are. When the mode of production is still capitalist. But if you look at, for example, South Africa, which 10 years after the end of apartheid, only around 1% of all the land that was projected for redistribution has actually been redistributed. And I think you'll find there's a similar picture in all the so-called the democratic regimes that you'll find in the third world, for example, and in general as well. I would say in that time there's been a kind of greater tendency towards concentration of wealth in fewer hands and monopoly, etc. So yeah, I think that kind of element of the permanent revolution, the importance of the theory of permanent revolution still stands really. People still don't have the right to their own bit of land.
you. I'll take myself very briefly then. I had a question for you, Luke, actually, on this. I mean, obviously, hegemony is a buzzword, particularly within academia, but not only. And I think, granted, I'm biased because I am a student at SOAS. But this is something that I feel, as a student of politics, is very, very often used as some sort of panacea of all sorts of evils, and all sorts of clashes, be it ideological or not. So all sorts of dichotomies, particularly in international relations, when you try to analyze, particularly, the question of the U.S. as the main hegemon, the superpower, whatever it is. And I wonder how much fallacy or reality is in that concept. And then secondly, and perhaps very linked to that, I study under the orientation of Charles Tripp, who was a Middle Eastern Studies professor at SOAS, and he studies hegemony, and he considers hegemony an unfinished project. I wondered if you could perhaps push on a bit on that subject as well. But yes.
I think I don't agree. That Gramsci, was the one who as it were, rescued Marxism from, a deterministic, straightforward economistic, deterministic sort of, outlook. I think that's been put around since, as long as I've been in politics. It became very popular. It's often associated with Gramsci. Certainly Gramsci did make criticisms of existing Marxists. But the fact is, of course, Gramsci would never have said that he was the one, who made such a sort of turn, because precisely he thought Lenin, and the Bolsheviks, and that were the force, which had done precisely that. That's why he initially called the Russian Revolution the revolution against capital, by which he meant, at that time, he thought, that the whole Western movement had been dominated by Marx's capital and hadn't, really ignored Marx's politics, if you like, and the whole, the Communist Manifesto, the political writings of Marx, the revolutionary dynamic, in Marx's thought, and so on. But the fact is that we know a lot more now, and of course there's a lot more in English than there was than that 40 years ago. We know an awful lot more about the Marxism of the Second International, including the Marxism of Gramsci. It was usually given as the most terrible example of a kind of deterministic person who thought history just moved forward, inevitably and so on, and that. And the discussions that have come published in various books, including one called Witnesses to Permanent Revolution, published by Historical Materialism, show very clearly, Kautsky's incredibly creative role alongside Pavas, Trotsky, and Lenin, in a fantastic debate about what was the nature of the Russian Revolution going to be. Was it doomed to be a bourgeois revolution in some sort of schematic, way? Was it possible that the working class could exercise hegemony over the peasantry and lead it beyond, the bourgeois, and indeed was forced to lead it beyond, the bourgeois revolution, a revolution that would result only in the development of capitalism, in Russia. Now, that is a vitally important thing. Likewise, I think, as I think Luke has shown, Trotsky, and Lenin and the Comintern, the source of Gramsci's, understanding, of the importance, of this whole question about how does one fight when one's not in an immediately revolutionary situation. And if you look at Trotsky's writings and speeches at the Comintern Congress, he says, that unfortunately most of the comrades who've come to us, in the West, think, that all the Bolsheviks did was to carry out an insurrection. And therefore, all you need to do is to point yourself, as it were, declare your party, point yourself, at the bourgeois state, and go for it. And this ignores the fact that, the bourgeois state in the West has enormous reserves and so on. This is, he says this in some detail, long before Gramsci, comes that view, at a time when Gramsci didn't have that opinion, when he also thought, along with Bordiga, because he was a close ally of Bordiga for sort of 2 years, or more, he thought that was all that was necessary. But what Trotsky and the Bolsheviks in Russia, I think, succeeded in convincing Gramsci of, around the period of the Fourth Congress, and they were helped in this by by a tragic event, i.e. Mussolini kind of came to power about a week and a half before the Comintern Congress actually sort of met, Trotsky later on said, by the way, that Gramsci was the only person amongst the Italian communists who even conceived it was possible that Mussolini and the fascists could come to power. All Bordiga, all the rest of them thought it was just impossible, and took a totally passive attitude to it. The communists in Russia wanted to force the Italian communists to form a united front against fascism. Now, this becomes a historic, kind of question of Trotskyism because of the fact that this terrible ultra-left, this sincere ultra-leftism of the Italian communists under Bordiga, was reproduced on a massive scale as a very insincere and cynical ploy by Stalin in the third period between 1928-29 and 1933, and resulted in the triumph of Hitler, in Germany. Now, from then on, from the point that Gramsci is convinced, he really, does take up the question of the united front, and that is one of the most important things. I think the reason why there is, in one sense, I think for Italians it would be a bit of a shock to say there's no Gramscian tradition, because after all, Gramsci is the leading Marxist of the period of the Communist International. So I think one would qualify Luke's statement a bit on that front, because in fact Gramsci is the carrier of the traditions of the revolutionary Comintern into the movement. And it wasn't just a load of reformists in the Italian Communist Party who wanted to use Gramsci to justify reformism, understandable, and also they wanted to dump Stalin without having to address the question of Trotsky. So they brought in Gramsci, but because Gramsci was not able to articulate a kind of an explicit criticism, of Stalin and Stalinism. They were able to manipulate, Gramsci in this, or the legacy of Gramsci in this way. But I think that if you go and look at the writings of Gramsci in the 20s, the political writings that he wrote when he wasn't in prison and wasn't having to use Aesopian language, the sort of language deliberately designed to avoid the censor, and not only to avoid the censor, but possibly to avoid fellow communists in the prison, that meant that you see much more clearly what Gramsci is about, and that Gramsci is an important figure of the Communist International in the 1920s, and whatever. And the last point is that the other strong point of Gramsci was that he, as far as he could ever do so, he opposed the idea of expelling forces from the Communist International. So, for example, even when he heavily criticised Trotsky and the left opposition, he wrote a letter to the authorities in Moscow, the ECCI, saying protesting against the treatment of the left opposition. Togliatti suppressed it, or rather only showed it to the top leaders and not to the rest of them.
Thank you. Before I proceed to the next contribution, I just wanted to reiterate that if you want to put questions, you're more than welcome to do so as well. So you don't have to have an increasing or an incredible knowledge about Gramsci to make a contribution. Yes, please.
Well, I'm glad you said that. A few questions and things I didn't quite agree with. Let's see, I might agree with. Could you, Luke, forward to the quote from Trotsky and the quote from Gramsci, please?
There we go.
That's it, yeah. The task of the base of submitted solution into the political superstructure. In Gramsci's version, the fundamental conflicts appear to us at the level of ideology and of consciousness. Don't quite, to me, seem to be the same things there, and a slight problem with them. I mean, isn't Trotsky's saying that when the masses are faced with the tasks of, we cannot continue in the same old way, bread, peace and land, in the famous agitational slogan of the Bolshevik Party in 1917, the only way that can be solved is by smashing the state. You can't solve that through reform. You've actually got to have a political solution. The class struggle is a political struggle for political power. Whereas Gramsci's seems to be there, and again, this is a question because, as you said, I don't have to be a student of Gramsci yet, but the fundamental conflicts appear to us at the level of ideology and consciousness. In the sense that the understanding that it is a class struggle, it's not just a struggle against a single employer or a struggle against a single war, like the Iraq war, but that it's actually, this is a class system. I can understand that you can't, but I think it seems to me that some fundamental conflicts appear to us, actually appear to many of us, first of all, and not at the level of ideology, but at the level of the base. For example, the 2 to 3 million people are going to go on strike on November the 30th. It appears to them that there is an unfairness, and actually, because of the crisis of the system, it's very easy for us to go in there as political agitators and propagandists to sort of make that link and so on. But very often it seems to me that it appears at the level at the base for many of us. I thought also, I had a question about the, I don't think there's a slide for this, but the historic alliances and so on. It would appear to me that if Gramsci had a problem with the working class hegemony and talked about an alliance of classes, subaltern classes, to challenge the hegemony of the bourgeoisie and to isolate the bourgeoisie and build blocks, that I can see as being something that would appeal to someone like Stuart Hall of the Euro-communists. And isn't there a, or I'll put it as a question, what did Gramsci say about the need at a certain point for the working class to lead a revolution in an alliance with the poor peasantry and the urban poor and so on, but the working class to lead a revolution? Because if you just have the counter-hegemonic block of classes, then aren't you in danger of something like the Nicaraguan Revolution, which fails to, the working class failed to lead it further, and so it became a half a revolution for 10 years, which never actually expropriated the big bourgeoisie, because many of its allies, in fact its leadership, was a layer that actually was one of the propertied classes, the Sandinistas, and therefore because it never actually overthrew the bourgeoisie and expropriated their power and their wealth, the revolution was eaten from within, and the counter-revolution succeeded in the end. So it seemed to me that unless Gramsci was absolutely clear about the purpose and the limits and the need for the working class to lead a revolution, then his ideas could be appropriated by the Euro-communists and others who actually, had a sort of block of four classes, or that kind of Stalinist approach, which has been a tragedy in the Third World and the Global South for for very many decades.
Thank you. Unless do you want to come back on a couple of questions in the gift time, or yes, your contribution there?
Yeah, it's like the idea of hegemony. What Joanna said, I'm probably taking this idea, totally out of context, the idea of hegemony as being, was it an incomplete project?
Yes, the idea is that it's unfinished project.
Unfinished, yeah. So, as I understand it, sort of in terms of international politics, hegemony of a state over another state, or several states, hegemony is really sort of a matter of illusion. It's not, when a hegemon is really forced to enforce its hegemony, it's often very, very difficult and risky. It's about illusion. I mean, Obama sticking 200 Marines in Australia instead of up to 2,500. I mean, this all posturing. This isn't a force that's really meant to defend Australia from an unnamed enemy. But I'm not really sure if that understanding, which may be false, of hegemony really applies to social hegemony. So I guess my question is, sort of conceptually and in real terms, what is the relationship between social hegemony and political hegemony?
Does anyone want to come back on that, or do you want to answer a couple of questions? I saw you had loads of points.
I was just writing them, isn't it?
Briefly, I mean, I've kind of lived through the hijacking of the translations, some of them incompletely partial, of Gramsci by what Lenin called the catheter socialists, people who sit in universities and draw good salaries, and that use that in post-1968 period to carve themselves out of space, which was neither Stalinist nor reformist. And that was part of the, as you know, better than I do probably, the left agenda of Penn Anderson, people like that. Now, that's, if you want, the hijacking of Gramsci, and then it morphed into cultural studies. Now, on the other hand, one of my colleagues might also join me in this. I mean, is it possible to actually conceptualize a kind of Gramscian politics out of the critiques of reformism and Stalinism through practices? Through one of the practices, for example, something which comes from this Gramscian politics is the prefigurative structures. When you occupy factories, etc., you set into motion certain things which then become the seed of a great thing. So, I mean, in a way, I agree with you that Gramsciism is rooted in the Bolshevik Revolution and the huge ferment which came out of that. We should definitely take it away from the kind of the cultural studies people and the Euro-communists, etc. But somewhere along the line, I'd like to hear from you, and you're writing a PhD on this and everything. Is there kind of a space? Can we talk effectively about kind of Gramsciite politics, which might open up certain spaces and certain forms of contestation and challenges? And is it worthwhile politics, or do you want it to be subsumed under the general category of Trotskyism?
Sorry, just a second. Hegemony, sort of a question about hegemony. Yeah. I mean, the term that people use a lot of these days is soft power, isn't it? That there are ways, kind of a state, exerting, its control without actually having to go to war. But kind of in Gramsci's conception, and it goes back to beyond before Gramsci, as well. It's the idea that really you need the two. Kind of that. And if you're entirely forced to sort of resort to armed force to get your way, this is a sign that the system is approaching a revolutionary crisis. Kind of that, because it's actually, it may be an immediate counter-revolutionary situation as well. But it's in any case, it's not in a stable, kind of situation if it has to resort to armed force to kind of to rule. It must seek, kind of to get the consent of the various classes below it. Parts of the working class, the middle class, and so on. What Gramsci calls the subaltern classes, and so on. And I think that is an important, kind of conception. Kind of in Gramsci, and it is appropriate, kind of to describing, kind of the world today. But I think Luke explained very well how, kind of for Gramsci. I mean, to Jeremy's point, I think, kind of, if you read Gramsci's writings in the 90s, well, all the things that he could publish, because he had to, it stopped completely, kind of in 1926 publishing. All we have is is that it's absolutely clear that what he's talking about is a revolution, that the whole purpose is to move towards a revolution. And his ideas of gaining hegemony, I mean, the other thing, I think I'll put this as a question, if Luke will say more about the question, but one of the enormous valuable things that Gramsci did, was to address the southern question, kind of the fact that Italy, half of Italy, kind of was largely made up, kind of incredibly impoverished peasants, kind of that. And it's an unevenness that exists, going to be even to this day, I mean, I don't mean that half of the South is still all peasants, but nevertheless, the lack of development, that took place in the southern part of Italy was crucial. And that for Gramsci, therefore, the question was how did the working class in the north, which was largely in the north, going to exert a political leadership over the peasants. It had to exert force against the bourgeoisie, but it had to, win over and lead the peasants. Now, obviously, there's a dialectical relationship between those two things. That is, only if you show that you are capable of fighting the bourgeoisie, and only if the working class can show its power, its forcefulness, will it actually, be able to win over the peasants? Because the peasants then think there is another force in society that could free us from our terrible, oppression, other than, our own forces, which have proved unable and always being. Well, the other question I'd like to ask is about Gramsci and the intellectuals, because people often say Gramsci gave a particular role, which is unlike other Marxists, to the intellectuals.
Thank you very much. Unless someone has something permanent to say now, I'll bring Luke back. And don't run away as soon as Luke finishes, because I'll just give you a bit of information on the next session and where we have some drinks afterwards, which I'm sure all of you are very interested in. So
yeah, okay, cool. Well, there's quite a lot of questions. I mean, maybe the first question is, I mean, on the contrast in the quotes between Gramsci and Trotsky. I mean, I'm not actually saying that Gramsci and Trotsky were saying the same thing in those extracts, but rather what I was arguing is that there's a common concern for the superstructure in their conceptions of historical materialism. And I mean, in Marx often described the superstructure as a form of social consciousness. And so when he refers, I mean, I think in the post-war tradition of Marxism, sometimes superstructure has been arguably vulgarized slightly to just refer to kind of institutions that are built on top of the economic, if you like. But for Marx, arguably, it's actually a form of social consciousness. It's the ideas, values, and institutions that we create to make sense of our lives. And so Gramsci and Trotsky were both very alert to that dimension of historical materialism. So when Gramsci says we become aware of the disputes in the economic base at the level of ideology, at the level of consciousness, he's saying that actually in our material and social reproduction, we become aware of our own existence through at the level of consciousness, at the level of ideology. So if you use Jeremy's example of the worker who becomes aware in the strikes of class politics, then this is a transformation that is taking place at the level of social consciousness, happening within a class struggle. Gramsci explicitly opposed what became known as the politics of the Popular Front. His whole notion of the historic bloc and hegemonic alliances was that the working class should come to the head of popular democratic movements, of the peasantry, of the subaltern classes, and so on and so forth. So he was explicitly and decisively opposed to Popular Front politics. I mean, and his whole conception of the Revolutionary Party was such that it had to win legitimacy in the hearts and minds of the working class by creating this kind of organic relationship with the working class. But I mean, I would argue that this is actually a very, very Leninist conception. But the problem is that Leninism has been bastardized by the Stalinist experience, and today we need to, if you like, rediscover that Leninist hegemony. I mean, Joanna asked, well, hegemony, she put it quite nicely, is it fallacy or reality? What's the use of this concept? Well, I think that hegemony does definitely, I mean, Gramsci's use of the concept is very, very flexible, as I said. So in the sense that he can use it to describe the leadership of hegemonic states in the international system, but he can simultaneously use it to describe how domestic ruling classes establish consent and rule for their power. And I think I think Gramsci is basically right in saying that any ruling class has to achieve its power through a combination of consent and coercion. And if you like, the politics of coercion are necessarily historically limited. So, you can well use like Gramsci's conception of passive revolution and hegemony to understand some of the contradictions that exist in how ruling classes globally are responding to the current financial crisis. I mean, this is arguably a classic example of a passive revolutionary crisis, in the sense that ruling classes in the West in particular see the hegemonic institutions that they've established over decades thrown into profound structural crisis, but their response to it, say in the Eurozone, is, in Gramscian terms, passive, if you like, i.e. they don't and they cannot, if you like, tear up the institutions that they've accumulated over decades. They don't want to, so they're constantly responsive to each of the crises, and the formation of technocratic governments in Italy and Greece to respond to this are classic examples of what Gramsci is talking about in passive revolution. It's a conservative response to a deep-seated and fundamental structural crisis. I mean, is there a I guess I was being provocative. I mean, there's a danger in when you're being provocative and saying, well, there's no Gramscian tradition, because you're correcting, or seeing yourself as correcting a kind of lost heritage or a lost side of Gramsci's politics that related very much in a formative way to the revolutionary Comintern. There is a danger of losing sight of, if you like, the contribution that Gramsci did make to Marxism, and I think that contribution was very real. And in his writings in the prison notebooks, there is in his notion of hegemony, there is a notion of the resources and power that capitalism and capitalist ruling classes have that are not merely economic, that also have this superstructural ideological basis to it. And I mean, for example, in his writings on Americanism and Fordism, I mean, Gramsci makes us, bear in mind this is the early 1930s, when the process of Fordist transformation of production is just in its moment of genesis, if you like. Well, Gramsci makes a series of what would prove to be very, very prescient observations about the implication this change in the United States would have for every single political regime inside Western Europe, that it would force through competitive pressures this Americanization of Western Europe. I mean, Billy asked earlier, so democratic revolution is about more than simply votes, and I mean, I agree. I mean, it's attached to the notion of democratic revolution, and the whole discussion of it in the early communist movement had attached to a whole series of different demands, including land for the peasantry and the agrarian revolution, that made it explicitly social and revolutionary democratic. But I mean, I would argue again that there's a definite continuity between Gramsci's notion of the passive revolution and the kind of permanent revolution that Trotsky associated with the politics of working class leadership of the democratic struggle. So, you could well see the creation of a large number of liberal democratic regimes globally over the last 20 to 30 years, bound up with the neoliberal revolution in the West, in Western capitalism, and all the negative sides to that as well. You could well see this as a kind of global passive revolution, this global liberal democratization of the South and East. But I think the crucial point that Gramsci and Trotsky bring to light is that the insufficiency politically of this process, that you need to press on and demand more. But I think we shouldn't just, I think the notion of passive revolution, because it's, and in Gramsci's Marxism generally, is that it's linked to this idea that the struggle of people for democratic rights has to be, and demands and so on, the ruling class has to respond to these political aspirations. So the expansion of liberal democratic regimes globally in the context of the neoliberal revolution. I mean, it's neither a wholly positive or a wholly negative experience. It creates spaces for revolutionary Marxist agitation, and you see that very, very kind of explicitly in the democratic revolutions that are currently sweeping the Middle East. So what the ruling classes of the Middle East will want to achieve is a Gramscian passive revolution, to create institutions that hegemonize the rule of capital in those states but respond to the demands of the masses. But what revolutionary Marxists should be fighting for within that context is the politics of permanent revolution. The working class should come to the head of the democratic revolution and proceed on to socialist tasks in the classical perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So, for all those interested and for those who truly enjoyed today's lecture, there'll be another one in 3 weeks' time, and that means on the 7th of December. Thank you very much for coming. And the topic will be, after the 30th of November strikes, what next? And on the panel we have, amongst others, Jerry Hicks from the United Grassroots Left speaking to us. If you want any more information about this, you can either talk to Simon, who's right there next to the bookstall, or you can go to workerspower.co.uk. We'll be going for some drinks now at the Duck and Dive, which is one of the bars downstairs. Oh, you'll be more than happy to join us. Thank you very much.
Oh, are you recording that?
Goodie.
Oh shit, I think I put my pencil case over the top of it.
No, just now. I've been through this.
Oh, okay, sorry, I realised that.